book, Shiela Zurbrigg's book, is wonderful. It's ambitious, deeply researched, and very, very carefully argued. It's a substantive book, over 400 pages, and it's filled with a wealth of data. Held together, all this data and the details are held together, I think, by a very, very strong narrative line. And it's important to understand that narrative structure of the book at one level. I'll come back to that later. The essential arguments are actually all set out in the introduction. So if you read the, if you want to know the argument, you read the introduction, you will see what she's really arguing. These seemingly simple set of conclusions and arguments are actually, how she comes to it is demonstrated through the book. So the book is, the arguments don't come right at the end of the book, they are at the beginning of the book. And then she shows why and how and through what records and what methods she comes to those set of arguments. The general conclusions have already been mentioned by Imrana, but to recap 3 or 4 of these points, Shiela argues that malarial mortality in its epidemic form was connected to the history of hunger and destitution. And this is one of the most important arguments of the book. When I started my research in the 1970s, mid-70s, and many of us looking at demographic history and history of medicine and medical histories, being powerfully influenced by socialism and Marxism, we wanted to believe that it is destitution and hunger which causes death and mortality, high rates of. But the existing literature showed that there is no simple correlation. And Shiela's book actually demonstrates that correlation. Therefore, I was extremely glad. I knew of her argument because I'd read all her papers earlier. So I was very glad that this argument has been made with so much power in the book. What she refers to as a fulminant form of malaria, that is the most lethal form of epidemic malaria, different from the endemic form which always exists within society, which is there after, during, in its most virulent form, possibly in August, September every year. But it doesn't acquire that epidemic form or lethal form which leads to very rapid rise of mortality rates. That epidemic form is linked up with hunger, whereas endemic form could be linked up with a host of other factors. That endemic form becomes epidemic form under certain situations, and that's destitution and hunger. Epidemiological research and solutions alone, therefore, if you go on discovering solutions based on epidemiological research, you cannot find a solution to the problem of malaria. You cannot control malaria. So it cannot be done. Malarial control cannot be done simply by tracking transmission through mosquito larvae, and she discusses this at length. It could not be solved simply by distributing quinine. It had to actually address the underlying causes, the conditions of destitution and starvation. So this is something she looks at with great care through the book. The decline of malarial mortality, especially after the second decade of the 20th century, was not linked up with epidemiological research. It was linked up, as Imrana has already mentioned, that it was linked up, according to Shiela, by much more sustained efforts to control poverty and destitution, not poverty so much, but destitution, high levels of destitution and hunger during periods of scarcity in the agrarian areas. Now, this general argument, overall argument, Marx, I think, and everyone knows, Mohan has referred to, Imrana has referred to, a substantive shift in the thinking about malarial and disease history. We move from the germ theory and histories based on the germ theory to histories based on human factors, to the causes linked up with a human history. From a focus on transmission and vector control, that is how to control the mosquitoes and the larvae, to focus on the host, that is the recipient of the disease, the infection. And that's for me, a wider argument of the book and implication of the book, that is from a triumphalist history, a narrative, triumphalist narrative of science and technology and modernity, where science triumphs over human conditions and natural conditions. That's the underlying argument of Davis's thing. Also, that is, in the West, science, there is a socio-economic cause, etc., etc. In colonial countries, nature and society creates the problem. Western science conquers that problem and resolves all that problem. Now, this is an argument. The book is an argument against it, without stating it ever, without stating it in a form that many of us might do. It is actually arguing against that modernist, technocratic modernist, scientistic argument of a triumphal science conquering everything, and it moves history to question, it moves us and to the history of suffering and destitution and hunger and questions of class and questions of gender through the book. Shiela develops this argument, the overall argument, she develops in 5 different ways, I think, in the initial part of the book. There is a structure in that argument. First, she develops the overall argument, a general argument which applies to the entire province. She offers a general overview of overall figures, overall correlations, a relationship between rainfall and mortality rates, a relationship between prices and mortality rates, then a regression analysis of which includes prices, rainfall, and mortality rates. In order to understand what exactly is going on, which is the major determinant? Did rainfall directly lead to high mortality? The argument is necessary because a lot of literature has focused on high rainfall, waterlogging, water accumulation, and that water being a water body being the basis of malarial spread. Now she looks at that very carefully, and then she looks at prices, because if harvests are bad and there is scarcity, prices rise, and therefore price peaks in price. The upward movement of price becomes an index of not only scarcity but of destitution. The poorest will be affected by high prices in all situations. So if there is a positive relationship between high death rates and high prices, then there is a clear relationship between destitution and mortality. And if there is a positive relationship between high rainfall and prices, then flooding and rainfall is actually leading to the spread of the disease. Now, the overall picture shows that there is a weaker correlation between rainfall and death rates, mortality rates, and a sharper correlation between price and mortality rates. And if you look at rainfall, then if you do a regression through rainfall and prices, then you see that rainfall becomes important only when it coincides with the price rise. Otherwise, that effect of the rainfall is muted. So this is an important insight which very clearly, through a substantive statistical calculation and demonstration of figures over a 50-year period earlier up to the early first decade of the 20th century, and then subsequently for the subsequent 4 to 5 decades, demonstrates this point at the overall level. From this overall picture, she wants to look at a variation within the province. Because just first to see whether the overall picture is sustained by the variation, and whether there is a variation which demands that we qualify our general picture. And by looking at the district variation, she shows that again flooding, the general question of there's a common argument which has been made over the last 100 years and very strongly made since Whitcomb made this point, that there is the expansion of irrigation led to waterlogging, bad alignment of canal lines led to waterlogging, and that led to malaria. Now, she counters this argument by showing that there is no direct correlation between canal areas and waterlogging and malaria. Now this she demonstrates very carefully through a correlation of all these factors at the district level of all the districts of Punjab. So therefore she moves from the provincial level to the district level. But looking at the district level, you find discrepancies. Now how do we resolve the discrepancies? So she moves to the third level, which is taking up each of these discrepant figures of 76, 1879, 84, 90, and 2-3 others to look at the individual histories of these mortality years and show that while it doesn't correlate with either rainfall or price rise, there is a prehistory of destitution in here. The earlier 2-3 years, if you go back 2-3 years, you find that the poorest were actually in a terrible state. They were, and in a state of destitution, hunger, and want, they succumbed to malaria when it did come. So therefore, the individual detail feeds into the overall picture in order to explain the discrepant figures. At a fourth level, she moves from here to look at how gender, age, and class affects these figures. So how does, and by looking at that, she again shows that the poorest were not only the most susceptible, the poorest also actually were more prone to have relapse of malaria because the recovery rate was slow and there is an incubation of infection within the body, whereas those who are not destitute could actually recover much more early. Similarly, women were more, infants were more prone to malaria, and women in Punjab were more prone to malaria, infants were more prone to malaria because Punjab was known for infanticide, was known for starving the women, children to death, and it is here she suggests that because of that reason there is a widespread high mortality rates amongst infant girls in Punjab. Through this disaggregation, individuation, and then looking at the differentiation between different class, gender, she then comes to returns to an overall picture in order to argue out her point that ultimately it is destitution and death. You cannot explain it otherwise. In developing this argument thus, what she is doing is to connect in some sense that as a historian I see history of malaria with the history of destitution and hunger, and the epidemiological history and the medical history to social history. And that's very, very critical. In doing social history, and when we come from social history to medical history, we are not always equipped to do the medical properly. But it is, and when the medical doctors come to social history, they cannot do it always very well. They cannot look at the records very well. This is a history where I think the two comes together wonderfully well. And the history of mortality and the history of colonial policy is linked to the policies of the post-colonial period in looking at this history. Just 1 or 2 points on the narrative strategy and then 2 or 3 questions. Can I take? Yeah. This rich and dense detail, the enormous amount of material that she is marshalling is actually, I think, folded into a human story of confrontation of two individuals. With opposing views, critiquing each other, advocating their opposing ideas about malarial mortality and the way it could be prevented and eradicated. These two protagonists of the story, one is her hero, that is the Christopher, and the other is Ross, the Nobel laureate who offered a more germ theory and argued against this entire theory of destitution leading to malarial spread. Now, these two characters keep recurring. They appear in the introduction and they appear through the chapters. Every chapter they appear. When they came up in the first chapter, I said, look, I know a lot about them already. But then you find that they are, she's telling a different story but through them in the next chapter. And this goes on chapter after chapter. So it's wonderfully, I think, held together by a narrative line, a narrative strategy which frames the story, where the voice of these two figures becomes a voice through which actually Shiela is carrying on a debate with her own opponents and arguing her own case. She develops the argument by unpacking their ideas carefully, following their activities and their publications, tracking the way the ideas were received within the medical community. Then she, in the statistical calculations and correlations and coefficients and the tables and the graphs, all these are mobilized in order to test their arguments. It is Christopher's arguments she is testing, and by testing that she is developing her own argument. It is Ross's argument she is testing, and through that she is again developing her argument. So this lethality of malarial argument is something which she develops through a negotiation with Ross and Christopher, the two figures who keep coming up all through the book. As I said, Christopher is our hero. You can see that in the book. The narrative strategy within the book, I think, makes this, Imrana referred to the fact that there's a lot of evidence, material, correlations. But the fact that all that is there, some of us who have done, Prabhu and I, we have done a lot of economic history in the 70s and 80s. Now historians don't deal with those figures, but we are very comfortable with those kind of regression analysis figures and correlation coefficients. So we are not, this is not forbidding to us. But in what I felt is that all those figures, which really come in the first 2-3 chapters, not so much as much in the others, it's lighter later on, but they are framed wonderfully well through this strong narrative which is developed through the two figures. And the debates they are carrying on, the discussion, their anger and rage against each other, the quieter, the more muted voice of Christopher and the more strident voice of Ross, all that is captured very, very well. So that's, I think, a thing which one needs to note about the narrative argument. But in tracking this story, I feel she is also doing, she's also developing layer by layer. In developing the story layer by layer, she's also developing a larger argument, I think, about how scientific knowledge develops. And that's a very, very critical thing. We all know about Kuhn's argument that paradigm shifts what defines the birth of a new knowledge within science. And she is marking that paradigm shift from the 1910s, in 1911 when Christopher's book comes out. But paradigm shift doesn't occur simply because a new idea comes up. What she shows here very, very well, I think, is that medical breakthroughs happen not through dramatic discoveries of a genius, a brilliant scientist who discovers. She's not stating it in these forms. I'm trying to draw it out of there because it's done through the material. It happens through decades of dialogue and debate, confrontations and negotiations, critiques and counter-critiques. Paradigm changes in scientific thinking is a question of persuading a scientific community to believe in the efficacy of an argument, of a new argument, which they are not ready to believe. They are not accepting Christopher. They are accepting Ross very often, because that is the triumph of science argument, which is so easily accepted by the West, and it affirms the superiority of the West. So this argument, the efficacy of the argument, the new argument, is something which is to be believed before a scientific truth becomes a scientific truth. So therefore, it takes 50 years, 40 years for something to come up. And it is taking actually 110 years, because it is in 1911 and Shiela is writing in 2019. And it is now that in this intervention we can say that argument is in some way, not finally settled, but very powerfully argued. The argument has been demonstrated. So the history of medical science or any other science has to track the history of these negotiations. those skepticisms, those disbeliefs. It is a history that has to follow the contours of those debates and negotiations carefully, capture the drama of the confrontations and demonstrations of how what was not believed came to be believed. In this case, it is particularly so because the protagonist, the second protagonist, the villain on the argument, Ross, is actually a Nobel laureate. No, it's not so easy to argue against it. Everyone believes in everything that Ross says. This is my overall, the way I negotiate and understood the book. Just a few questions. Very quickly, not as a critical comment, but as suggestions which possibly could even complement and develop. Now, I think in developing this, and I draw upon my own work now in a little bit on the last 25, 30 years, as 20 years since I've discussed the earlier work with you, and the way my own work shifts from my earlier work. I think a lot of this is premised upon a notion of an agrarian society, of agriculture. And I think we need to take into account the common lands, the forests, and how they affect the life of the destitute and the poor. Now that's extremely critical, and we often do not take that into account. Reservation of forests deprive the marginal social groups from using forest products as freely as they could do earlier. Entering the forest and claiming their use rights become a crime. A lot of people who entered but become now criminal tribes. Within the village, land policy of the British marked out commons, which was called Shamilat Deir, which were critical to the survival of the Dalits and the poor and the artisans in the village. It is the all critical times of the year, when there was no food to eat. They could go to the common land, get the produce and survive on that. And a lot of studies now show that disappearance of the commons is critical to the deepening of the deeper destitution of the Dalit groups and the poorer groups and the artisanal groups. And the Shamilat Day in Punjab disappear by the late 19th century and definitely by the early 20th century, because the landed proprietors parcel it out, and each of them, all proprietors had a claim to it. It was use rights were there for everybody. But ownership rights were given only to those who were proprietary holders of land in the village. And they parceled it out and made it their own. And after that, the Dalits could not enter, and the others could not enter. Therefore, this aggravates the problem of destitution. So this is something, and similarly, so forests and commons actually exploring that a bit will help deepen this argument about destitution in some form. One could, and this argument about forests actually might also explain why some of your correlations don't work in the southeast, southwest. This is not an area of, till your time, it is still not an area of irrigated land. It becomes irrigated in the 1910s, and the irrigation starts in 93. But a large part of the land is still not irrigated till 1920s. So it is
southeast or southwest?
Southwest. I'm talking of the southwest.
Yeah.
The southwest is being irrigated slightly later. So my suggestion is that because it is pasture land, because it is dry land, therefore price correlations don't work there, rain correlations don't work there. You have to have other indices to see what kind of destitution and why malaria, and actually those are the areas where malaria is least prevalent also in your. Now that explains, because it is it's a huge plateau of pasture land, grasslands, where there are very few people, no collection of, except the riverbeds. There are small pockets next to the river where there is collection of, and the price correlations or rain correlations with mortality will not work there. So there has to be other kinds of figures which one could discuss. There are one or two other points, but one argument, I think, the last argument is that in looking at the subsequent history, that you say the prevention history, that there are better famine code, there are better methods. So I think there you have to locate the British policy more centrally in relation to nationalist policy. The nationalist critique of British rule from the late 19th century is that it leads to famine, it leads to poverty, it leads to death rate, high death rate and mortality, and this critique made the British responsive. The British reacted to this by actually enforcing preventive measures. They had to redefine famine code. It's being debated in the assemblies. And in Punjab, the Unionist party is debating all these issues in the council. They say you have to have better measures, you have to protect us, you have to do this. And that leads to a set of measures which otherwise we can't expect the colonials to introduce simply because they are concerned about the population of Abhiyan. Their concern is very much linked up with the pressure that comes from the nationalist opinion and local opinions in various places. And that again will actually deepen your, strengthen your argument, because that explains why from the second decade, that's when nationalist movement is, in that second decade you have a new kind of policy towards the peasant. I'll stop there. But it is a wonderful book, and thank you for writing it.
Thank you, dear.